want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hi, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm your host, Rick Wilson. My guest today is David Rubenstein, who is a co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group. He is an author. He is a guy who's been deeply embedded in good causes and philanthropies for some time. He has a tremendous new book coming out called The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. And David, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. I wanted to ask you first, what was it that inspired you to write this book and to choose the authors you talked to about the presidency for this book?
Well, when I was a little boy, I remember John Kennedy driving past my house as in Baltimore and on his way to a campaign event. And ever since then, I've been enamored a bit with the presidency. In fact, so enamored that I wanted to work in the White House as a young man. And I did get a chance to do that for President Carter for 4 years. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, I've lived in Washington, and I've known every president since Carter, some better than others. And I just always had a fascination with the presidency. And in this particular case, I thought, why not have an interview with some of the living presidents? And then why not have an interview with some of the scholars on other presidents who are not alive, and try to put it together with my own perspective on what it means to be president of the United States for these people, and why the presidency is so important. And what I try to get people to come away from the book with is the idea that the president is the most important job in the Western world, maybe in the entire world these days, and has been since Woodrow Wilson's time. And people should vote for their president as a candidate of their choice. We only have about 2/3 of the people who are eligible to vote voting. And so you have about 60 million people or so who could vote who are not voting. And obviously the world would be different if every of these people voted. Perhaps it would be different, maybe it wouldn't be, but it'd be a good idea to be able to say that 80% of the people or 90% of the people who are eligible to vote actually did vote for the president.
One of the things I found fascinating about this was it wasn't just it wasn't sort of one of those top level glancing, like, chronicle of events that made or broke a president. You did get a lot of authors who really looked more at their background a little bit and how it shaped their approaches to the presidency. Of these stories, I know this is one of those hard to pick from the list questions. Of the stories, which one of the stories that you report here in the book and that your interlocutors have in the book surprised you the most about a president? What was it you didn't know about a president that you learned here and that shaped how you viewed him?
Well, let me just give you an example of how one book really affected me a bit. A book by Jonathan Darman, who's not a famous author, but he wrote his first book about the president. And this particular book was a book about FDR. And he pointed out that when FDR contracted polio up in Campobello, which is an island near Canada, where his family had spent a lot of time, for 30 days or so, people didn't know what it was. Had he gone to a doctor right away who was expert in polio, he could have been treated differently and probably, according to the book, might not have been paralyzed for the rest of his life. Why is that important? Well, because it changed the history of the world in this respect. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not considered a brilliant person initially, was not considered a great leader, but when he contracted polio, he had to remake his life, and he learned how to be much more determined, much tougher, much more engaging with people. And the skills that he exhibited as president for almost a little more than 3 terms were skills that he didn't really have before. And so you might think about it, if a really good doctor had gotten a hold of Roosevelt early on, he might have been able to keep him from being paralyzed. And maybe that would have been better for Roosevelt, would have been better for the world. We don't know, because Roosevelt showed skills that came about from the determination, the grit, the courage that he showed in learning how to live a life where he was essentially completely paralyzed below the waist.
Mm-hmm. So I'm two of the interviews that you have in here are with our two most recent the two previous presidents.
Right.
And you also have a Biden interview. You chose Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman, which I think those were terrific and logical choices. Did you find that their takes on the subjects that they're most intimately sort of focused on and associated with, were they influenced at all by the ebb and flow of what's still happening around both Obama's legacy and Trump's? When they talked about these men, because I mean Maggie is still reporting live as we speak on
Yes.
Trump, as we're talking today.
Right. Well, Maggie Haberman is a New York Times reporter, for those who don't know, who covered the New York Times, for the White House for New York Times. She also covered Trump before he was president and knew him reasonably well. And it's a very interesting relationship because she didn't actually live in Washington. Because of
Right.
family considerations, she covered the White House from New York.
From Brooklyn.
You would think it'd be hard to get sources. Right. But you would think it'd be hard to get sources, but she managed to do it. And one of the best sources, though she would never reveal it, was probably Trump. President Trump, who I do know reasonably well, likes to talk to the press, and I think he was one of her big sources. And I said in the book, you have to ask yourself, why does President Trump want to talk to people who almost certainly are not going to write favorable things about him? I think it's just that he's a born salesman, and salesmen always believe they can convince somebody to buy something. And I think he always thought he could get reporters to kind of report what he wanted. It didn't usually work. But Maggie wrote a really good book called Confidence Man, which is not a favorable book about Trump. There aren't that many favorable books that have come out of the White House about Trump from his former colleagues, or some that have been more favorable than others. And I do know him reasonably well, and I've interviewed him over the years, and I interviewed him for this book. In fact, while he was going on trial, we had some time in the morning, and he gave me an hour of his time to do an interview. And I put some of it in the book. I interviewed Peter Baker because Peter Baker had covered many presidents. He now covers the White House as well, but he covered and wrote a book about President Obama, who I knew reasonably well when he was president.
I'm interested about Obama's legacy because I still don't know how. I mean, as a semi-pro presidential historian, I still don't know how he's going to sugar out as a president in the end. I think well because of his sort of stature that he had, this natural ability to communicate very gracefully and persuasively, but I'm not sure how he's going to be remembered in terms of like a portfolio of accomplishments yet. Right. And that's not a partisan statement at all. That's just a sort of curiosity. I was wondering what you think about that.
I think history is written, and it often is said, you can't really tell whether a president is good or bad or how he should be recorded for about 40 years after he leaves office, because then you can go through the documents and everything is more or less public. But with respect to Obama, he's going to be known almost certainly for two things: being the first African American to be president, and for Obamacare. Obamacare is the healthcare system we sort of have now, and more or less it's a system that is not going to be changed all that much anytime soon. President Trump tried for 4 years to change it. He never got much progress in that. And now President Trump never talks about trying to change it if he's reelected again, because it's established. And it's really due to Obama, who, you might remember, it passed the House by one vote. So it barely passed. And it only got through because Nancy Pelosi was able to push it through. And something like that is really changed the way our healthcare system operates in many dramatic ways. In the case of being the first African American, I said in the beginning of the book, I think that if the founders were to come back, what is the event that would most surprise them about how the country turned out? And I was saying that many of the things the thing that might have most surprised them is an African American became president of the United States. Remember, the founding fathers, many of them were slave owners. The idea that these slaves could be citizens was startling to them. The idea that one would be president of the United States was unbelievable to them. So the fact that Obama was able to pull that off and also get health care through, those are the things he's going to be remembered for, in my view.
Going back in time a little bit, you had Ted Whitmer's interview about Abraham Lincoln, and a brilliant author in his own right. Lincoln is to my mind sort of the hinge of history president, the sort of
Right.
acknowledged as the most important in many many ways. What did you learn about that from the interview with Whitmer?
I think it is said that there have been more books written about Abraham Lincoln than any other American and maybe any other person, with the possible exception of Jesus Christ. So Lincoln has a wealth of books out there, thousands and thousands of them. And I picked this particular one because when I read it, it told me something about Lincoln I hadn't read anywhere else. Maybe I should have known, but I didn't. And it basically, the story is how after he uh, getting ready to come to Washington from Springfield, he had to take a very circuitous route because he
Mm-hmm.
couldn't go into the Confederate States. He was thought that he might be killed, and so in the route to the presidency, he traveled in some 60 plus different cities, made speeches in each one, went to Philadelphia, went to New York, and he was treated as a hero in so many places. Many people had never seen him before, so hundreds of thousands of people came out to see him. This is a man who's going to be president of the United States, maybe on the verge of a civil war, and people had never seen him before, and so they were trying to see what he looked like, and he gave a lot of speeches in that time. And it's amazing how the president of the United States to be had to sneak into Washington. He had to sneak in because there was an assassination plot almost certainly in Baltimore, so he switched trains and kind of foiled the effort that probably existed to kill him. And then he came to Washington and stayed in a hotel for about 10 days because it was thought it would be safer to stay in a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
It is amazing that Lincoln, and I've said that many times, he's by far the greatest president because he held the Union together. Other people in the North, had they been elected, would have said, look, if you want to go away south, go ahead, take your slaves and be a different country. Lincoln didn't believe that. He really wanted to keep the Union together. Now, we had a civil war. 3% of our population was killed, but
Sure.
Lincoln did, in the end, free the slaves and keep the country together.
Yeah, it is he's just the undeniable central figure in
Right.
in what would have been. We would have looked as somebody, I can't remember who it was. One time said we would have looked a lot more like Europe, of a hodgepodge of fractured smaller nation states.
Absolutely.
That would have
And
eventually.
Lincoln did this with humility.
Mhm.
I'm sorry. He did it with humility. You can't imagine Lincoln walking around the White House saying, I won the Civil War. Aren't I great? He just wasn't his style. And he left behind two of the greatest speeches ever given by any American. One
Yes.
was his second inaugural address, and the next was the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address, in 272 words, he described what America is all about. And nobody has written 272 words or 2,000 or 2 million words that has better described so succinctly what this country is all about. And that's why it lives on as the greatest speech probably ever given by a president.
I could not agree more.
He wrote it himself.
It is a
No
brilliant
speechwriters.
artifact. That is something I always wonder about too. And you're right about it takes 40 years for it to sort of settle out, to see what the actions and character and qualities of a president in some ways. The role of the speechwriter, speechwriters have been with us for generations, but it really didn't start to become more of an established institutional White House thing until, from my understanding, around the 1920s, and when Hoover had speechwriters that I know of. But
Right.
we do end up getting this question I always have in my mind of how much of it is the vernacular that they've sort of absorbed from the principle, and how much of it is a true channeling of the principle. And look, Ronald Reagan could read a hell of a speech, and his speechwriters were outstanding. And it's always fascinated me, how much we view their role and their personality through the matrix of speeches that are written for them by other people.
Look, Ted Sorensen was considered to be, I think, the greatest presidential speechwriter, and I dedicate the book in part to him because I did work for him for a while. But he had a mind meld with John Kennedy, so he knew what Kennedy was thinking so well, and they kind of influenced each other perhaps. But he could write something for Kennedy without having to talk to Kennedy because he knew what Kennedy would say.
Right.
That's different than, say, Peggy Noonan, who was a brilliant speechwriter, maybe one of the best in our times. But she wrote the famous speech on Pointe du Hoc that
Sure.
Reagan gave, and she had never met Reagan. In other words,
Right.
she went over there, she did the research, she wrote a great speech about the Pointe du Hoc D-Day Memorial service, and yet she had never actually met Reagan at that time. I'd say it's a different situation today. And like John Kennedy, with his great inaugural address, he was obsessed with the idea that people thought he wrote it because people didn't think he was that intellectually talented, and he had been accused of not writing profiles in courage. So he really wanted to make people sure that make them think that he actually wrote it. So what did he do? He played a trick on Hugh Sidey. Hugh Sidey was the Time correspondent for the White House. He asked Hugh Sidey to come back into the cabin of his private plane, the Caroline, and ask Hugh Sidey what he thought of this speech that he was about to give in 3 days. And Hugh Sidey said, "My God, he's giving a speech in 3 days, the inaugural address, and he's now writing it out in longhand. He's asking my opinions." So it was a trick, though, because what Kennedy had done is he'd taken a speech that Sorensen had largely written, and he took some paragraphs of it, wrote it out in handwriting, and he showed it to Hugh Sidey. So Hugh Sidey wrote an article saying, "I know Kennedy wrote the speech because I saw it in his own handwriting." and Kennedy got that trick from FDR. FDR did not write his first inaugural address. It was written by a Columbia professor named Raymond Moley, who later became part of Roosevelt's brain trust. And what happened was Roosevelt took the entire speech written by Moley and wrote it out in his handwriting, so he could say, "I wrote the speech." And later, that speech was sold for a lot of money, and Kennedy was aware of that. So presidents have done this for a long time to kind of make people think that they've actually written their speech, when in fact, very few presidents anymore write their speeches.
Yeah, I mean, in the modern era, there are squads of speechwriters, and there are, people with different areas of expertise, and the staffing and coordination process between agencies gets involved. Having worked in the H.W. Bush administration, that ping pong of coordination and rewrites sort of, it always seemed to polish the edge and the personality off of a lot of things, and God love him, but he was not a tremendous giver of speeches. H.W. was not a rhetorically gifted guy. There was a warmth about him when he got to it, but it was tough to get there.
Oh, you were talking H.W.
Yes, H.W.
Yeah. He had a complicated relationship with syntax and grammar in some ways. So, it is often said that his mother drilled in him the idea of not using the word "I" to brag about himself. So he would start sentences with the verb, and he didn't have a subject sometimes. But he was one of the nicest people I ever met in my entire life.
Absolutely.
As I point out in the book, he was affiliated with my firm for about 10 years after he left the presidency, and I got to know him, traveled the world with him, and an incredibly nice, polite person. I really enjoyed to know him.
Yeah, he was. He had a.
And what was your position? What did you do?
Oh,
what did you do?
I was
I
was just out of college. I was a Schedule C guy working transition team, White House for a little bit, and then over to the Defense Department with Dick Cheney. So it was a great experience for a young guy right off the boat, and did all the sort of legislative affairs, public affairs, got to travel, got to do Codels. It was it was for a young guy,
right.
eye-popping. And one of the things I was talking to a friend of mine about the other day, it was another alumni, and I said, "Remember we used to fire people for being rude?" He had a very interesting high standard for people, and you wanted to live up to it because he had that aura about him. You wanted to live up to that decency that he clearly had inside of him. You didn't want to fall short. You didn't want to have him look at you and go, why did you mess this up? Why did you do this wrong? It was like, Dad, you didn't want that sense that you had not delivered for the country.
Well, you mentioned Dick Cheney. I point out in the book that when I worked in the White House, had an experience in the transition when Carter was coming in and Ford was going out, Cheney was the chief of staff, outgoing for Ford. And so as part of the White House transition, I went to meet with him, and he gave us advice and so forth. But one of the ideas he said was, look, we're not coming in on January the 20th. We're going to stay at home. So there'll be nobody here from 9 a.m. to 12. So if a national emergency arises, you should probably have somebody come into the White House that day, because everybody is going to be up in the inauguration. And so if something happens at 1 o'clock, you got to have somebody here who can answer, because we're not going to be here.
Right.
And so I told this to Carter people, and they said, okay, you do it. So I went in, but of course I didn't know how to get into the gates that morning. Nobody knew who I was. And so Fortunately, the country didn't have any emergencies the first couple hours after the inauguration.
Well, I will say this: that was also something that HW was insistent on. It was like, make the transition work, make it work properly, make it work smoothly. This is the country's decided, and we're not going to play games. We're not going to keep people, out of the transition process until the last minute. We're going to do it like professionals. And I think that reflected, I think, partly his lifetime of experience in and out of government. So let me ask you this question the differences between HW and George W. Bush are meaningful. What was your take on George W. Bush when you were writing this and during that interview process?
George W. Bush was somebody I got to know before he was president. He was actually served on one of my company's boards for a while. I didn't really know him that well, but I got to know him through his father. He was completely different, as you may know yourself from the experience. George Herbert Walker Bush was really born and raised in the East Coast of the United States, and he moved to Texas. But George W. Bush was really from Texas, and he grew up and he viewed himself as a Texan. And he was different than his father. His father probably didn't have the sense of humor that George W. George W. has a pretty good sense of humor. George Herbert Walker Bush did, but it's different. And I think George W. Bush is more like his mother in many ways. His mother, if you know, Barbara Bush, was very cutting, and she would say something funny, but also could let you know that you weren't doing something right in a funny way. And George W. Bush might be the same. I've interviewed him many times. I'll interview him again soon. And there's an interview of him in the book. I think he's a very smart person, underrated in terms of his intellect, because he didn't really try that hard to be a superstar at Yale or Harvard Business School. But he has a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't work. And I think his post-presidency has been pretty successful. He's gotten things done. He's actually very happy now with what he's doing with his life.
That's my understanding. And I will say this from my experience, he's also remarkably well read, and people don't know that.
Yes, people think I remember he used to have reading contests with people who used to work for him who could read the most books of a certain type. And he was always reading books before he was president. I would see him all the time carrying around these large books. And he loves to read. He's a really big, and maybe because his wife was a librarian,
Right.
he really is into books.
Yeah, he certainly had a deep interest in history, and that didn't. In some ways, I think that Texas character thing that became the political. I wouldn't say it's a shtick, but it certainly seemed to like overmatch that idea. And there always was the cliche that back then was Jeb was the smart one, and yet somehow W got to be president, and Jeb got steamrolled by Donald Trump.
Well, remember this. I point this incident out in the book. What happened was George W. says, I'm going to run for governor. His parents didn't take him seriously. They didn't think he had a chance. But Jeb was running for governor of Florida. And so his parents chartered a plane to fly to Florida to celebrate the victory with Jeb. And then George said, what about me? And they said, well, you're not going to win. And then that night, Jeb lost and George W. won, which is not what the parents thought would happen.
It was a bit of a shock. I recall. So it was. One of the things I want to say about this book that I really appreciated as I was reading through the copy that was sent down is I think people, because of the way our country is structured, because of the way our government is wired, understanding how presidents lead and succeed and fail is important, I think, for people to have perspective on their era and their moment. So I really want to say, David, I think this is a very valuable book, and I think the sort of intimacy of the interviews feels like you were getting to both the direct interviews and the ones with the folks who have studied these people best. I really want to say I think this is a tremendous book as a sort of contemporaneous to give people a contemporaneous understanding of what every president goes through. There's a lot there are a lot of through lines here that obtain from Lincoln to today about how what leadership demands of presidents.
I agree. And I hope that people will take a chance to think about how different people can be when they become president. You should try to know as much as possible about them as you can. and then recognize that these people are going to have more impact on the lives of 6 billion people on the face of the earth than any other single person. One person can have an enormous impact. And that's why I think I really encourage people to learn about the presidents, the presidential candidates, and vote.
Absolutely. It is unique in this world that we still get to, given the power that is reposed in that office, that people, I think they should be more surprised that we still get to vote for it in a lot of ways, because that is very appealing. It is a very almost addictive in its power. And I will say, I think reading this, it strongly reminded me of one of the great books about the presidency, of What It Takes, which, chronicled a generation of people who wanted to be and who became president. And I think it stands up very well in that regard. So, David Rubenstein, I want to thank you so much for coming today on the Enemies List.
Thank you.
And folks, the book is
My
The
pleasure.
Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. It is terrific. Not only if you're a presidential historian nerd like me, but it is a terrific read. I really recommend it, and it will be released on September 17th. So, folks, go out, grab it, and take a look at it. You will learn a lot about the most important job in the country. Hey, folks, look, I know I've beating this drum a lot lately, and I want to predicate it once more by saying this is not about anyone, especially me, a member of the opinion class, the media class, whatever you want to call it, right? But for the love of God, people, you cannot continue this double standard. You cannot continue to pretend that this is a normal Republican versus a normal Democrat. It is not. You cannot keep pretending that Kamala Harris saying the sky is blue and Donald Trump saying the sky is a sea of fire, they're placed there by my enemies to destroy America in a war of Marxism. You can't treat those two things as equivalent statements. One is by a crazy person. One is by a normal Democratic center-left candidate. I know there's this playing the refs game that guys like me used to play with the mainstream media very effectively. Hey, you're treating us like shit. You bastards are so liberal. You're a bunch of progressive shells. Blah, 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 blah. Look, I get that y'all are sensitive to this attack. I get that your marketing consultants have told you can go out and get the Fox audience someday. They're wrong. Don't conflate treating the views of Trump's audience with some degree or modicum of respect, which is fine if you want to do that, with accommodating Trump's madness and treating it like it's normal. It's not normal. It will never be normal. Don't do it. Stop. Don't be on the enemies list. Save yourselves. Bye.